All right, we did our physical workspaces. Let's go ahead and look at our virtual workspaces. But before we do, there's a few things that I want to call out that we haven't called out quite yet. And that's going to be these traditional measures versus the virtual measures. So, traditionally, we would look at distance in these projects, which might be steps, feet, miles. For our virtual workspaces, that is going to be number of clicks. Time, so minutes from start to finish of task, that might be the same. The other time piece that I didn't include on the virtual side, though, is that each click can be counted as a second. So if we think of distance as we're walking, that's like moving around, it's really obvious. But virtually, it's not as obvious when we're moving around. So we can use those clicks to measure that distance. And if we think each click takes a second, then that would be our time that we can add up to say if we reduce the number of clicks, then we reduce the number of seconds that we spend on that task. Now, I know it doesn't sound like much, but I've seen someone spend an entire week just using those seconds. So it can add up. So space taken up. So in a physical workspace, it's easy square feet, maybe number of shelves, you can really see it. But virtually, we have our number of folders, we have maybe the size, so megabytes or gigabytes that we're using, or even the space on our servers, right? So all of these are examples of taking up space in a virtual environment. Then we have touch points. So this is going to be the number of times that we touch an object. So in the physical example, I said I reached into the bag 17 times. But in a virtual environment, this might be a little bit different. So instead of that, we could look at something like the number of times we opened or navigated to a certain program, right? And reducing that would be reducing not just the number of clicks, but the number of times that we had to task switch. Even with two monitors, that can be something that does take up time or energy, cognitive energy from an individual, shifting their focus and their gaze and changing the way that they're entering materials. There's another tool that we didn't discuss, which is the spaghetti diagram. So, the spaghetti diagram started with somebody just putting a ball of red yarn in their pocket and then letting that yarn fall as they walked around doing the task. So, we see here in the first example, the physical example, we can see here doing the change in a bathroom, and we can see that little red line going all over the place as we do the activity. Now, in that example, it took 154 steps, which is about 385 feet per change. Now, if we were doing this at work and we said, hey, each of these happens 2 or 3 times a day, 5 days a week, 52 weeks a year, we could then calculate how many steps that we're currently spending and see when we make the change how that's reduced. But what about our virtual environments? So, in our virtual environments, what we're going to do instead of doing a spaghetti diagram is we are going to simply take a blank piece of paper and draw a circle. And in that circle or on the sides of that circle, you are going to list all the different uh, programs that people open or use during your observation. So, if you do an observation, this is how you can collect that data. And what you can do is you simply draw that red line between each of these items. And in between, you can even put down the number of clicks so that you start to say something like 154 clicks means that 2.5 minutes per of clicking per whatever item that you're doing, right? So this gives you then some measures of distance that you can use because you want to be able to tell that before and after story even in your virtual environments. Okay, so we can talk more about that. If you're interested in learning more about that, let me know. This is a tool that I've developed in the observations that I've done to make it as easy as possible to collect that information. So let me know if you want more information on that one. So the challenge on this one was I have a laptop desktop. It's really hard to find everything. There's a lot of stuff on it. I'm constantly using that search bar instead of just being able to click on a shortcut because there's a lot of junk on there. So there's about 45 items on my desktop and it takes 8 clicks for me to go ahead and print it or scan a document. Right? So that's just a little bit cumbersome for me. Now you can see here I have this beautiful picture that makes it really nice. But one of the things I noticed as I kind of came in here was that it made it really hard for me to see the stuff that's on there. So, one of the first things that I did was I changed it to a more neutral background so that I could actually see the items that were on my desktop. They didn't get lost in the mountain or the ocean there. First thing that we do, we ask what belongs. And so here, what I did was I group liked items and I said, which of these belong? The red ones are trash. I never use them. They don't need to be there. The yellow one are things that I do use for the house. The green are things that I use for the family. And the blue are things that I personally use a lot. Right. So those blue things to me are going to be the most important because they really, really belong. The green items, other people use when they borrow my laptop. And the yellow items we kind of sometimes use for the home, but maybe they're not as critical or commonly accessed. So we ask that question, what belongs? Then we're going to set it in order by frequency of use. So we're going to ask that question, how often do I use these items? And we can see here there's a lot of items in red that I never use. And so we can think about those. Do those really need to be here? Should those be here? There's other items that I only use maybe once a year. Some things I use maybe monthly, like doing the builds. And then there's a few things that I use almost every time I access my computer. So this gives me a lot of good information to be able to make some decisions. The next question is, well, what are the processes that I'm completing when I want to use my laptop? And this is kind of a funny question to ask when we think of something at home, but as I thought about it, there were really two main tasks that I repeatedly used for my laptop. One of those was accessing TV shows. And to do that, I needed to go to my VPN and then I needed to open my Chrome. So those were two things that I was constantly going in between. Another thing that I use a lot is I download a picture or an item, and then I'm opening up a PowerPoint to create some kind of course or PowerPoint presentation. So that was a really other common thing that I was doing when I accessed my laptop. Those were the two most common activities that I did when I opened it. So I started thinking about those processes and the actions that I take. And what I found was I could actually move a lot of those items that I saw I used frequently or I used monthly. I could move those into folders where I could access that once a month and all of those items would be right there. I also identified that, when I open Chrome, it's pinned to the bottom. I can move my VPN so it's right next to the bottom. So I made those changes to be able to move around my desktop items so they were as close as possible to the items that I used at the same time. I discovered along the way that actually the app for the printer was on my desktop and I didn't have to go searching for it for 15 minutes every single time like I had been. So I made sure that that was visible right next to the search bar because that's where I was used to looking for it, was going into the search and trying to remember what it was called. So I reduced all of that movement that I had and I really identified some of those items that I had been missing. But then the question becomes, how are we going to maintain this? So, what steps can we make uh, that can make this stick for us? How are we going to make sure that my laptop desktop still looks like this? So, I said here that we're going to set the expectation across the whole family that nothing gets saved onto the desktop. So we don't want anything to be saved on the desktop. It's really easy for us to see if it does because there's not much on there, and we have this really blank background now. So it's really easy to see if something pops in. I also set a quarterly reminder to do an audit. Now, if this is at work, you probably have huddles or other activities that you can do to keep your team accountable. It's great to do maybe an audit or an inspection weekly or monthly and go ahead and rotate the ownership of that. That way, you're independently or individually managing that process to be able to say, hey, it looks like somebody saved something here. Let's address it now before it gets out of hand. So the longer that you don't address something like that, the more people think it's going to be optional. So if you have a rule like that, like don't save things on a desktop, somebody does it and nobody follows up, now they can save it there all the time, right? So this is something that you can do in a huddle or a monthly meeting or a weekly. connect, to be able to hold those individuals accountable so that we sustain those changes. Because that's the question, right? Is how are we going to keep it up? We're going to get benefits from this. We want to keep those benefits. So previously I had I had 8 clicks to be able to print. Now I only have 3 to be able to print. I had 45 items on my desktop. Now I only have 7. So you can see here we've made some huge improvements virtually. And this is something that you can use as well, whether you're talking about a form, whether you're talking about a folder, a SharePoint site. This is all the same that you can use in your work. So maybe identify something that you could try this on, maybe your desktop or a folder, to be able to do some cleanup here and see if you can have the change that you want to see. Now, make sure to do that screenshot, which is the equivalent of the photo for your virtual workspaces.